Spring came early that year. Just as March arrived, behold, there was no snow to be seen. This was an unfamiliar sight for these pots. Puddles were everywhere, and even patches of grass had started to show through. Soon, migratory birds, as if sensing the warmth, appeared in the sky. "Look, the buzzards are already circling," the elderly folks would say, observing the soaring predators in the sky. And right away, they would start discussing how rapidly everything was changing in the world. Blamed for it all was global warming. What was that? Well, if a bird was flying home earlier than usual, it meant the scientists weren't lying. Indeed, something was changing in nature, and clearly not for the better. The elderly folks loved to chat and sprinkle a bit of horror, but the youth didn't have time to listen. They had work to do. In the small village, life after the winter lull was stirring, as busy as a springtime village could be. Samuel had returned to his hometown 6 months ago. He hadn't liked the city, noisy, stuffy, expensive. But where could he get the money? He wasn't making much in the auto repair shop, and whatever he earned, he spent on food and housing. His home was calling him. Moreover, his mother was there alone, getting older, already unwell. He left her with a heavy heart. How was she managing without him? And then, his mother shared some joyful news. A farmer had appeared in their village, fixed up the abandoned farm buildings, brought in some machinery, and seemed to be planning to sow the fields in spring. He was looking for workers, men to hire. "Maybe you'll come back, son. You're a great mechanic. Your father taught you well. You've got an education, and your knowledge will surely help." Emma timidly asked him then. "I'll think about it, Mom," Samuel promised. Honestly, he wanted to shout right then and there. Yes, of course. But there was one catch. Melanie, his love. That's what was keeping him in the city. He had recently met Ira. Melanie worked as a waitress in a cafe not far from the auto repair shop where Samuel worked. Every evening, the two of them would leave work together. Initially, Samuel would accompany Melanie to her home, where she rented a room from a cantankerous old woman, and then he would walk back to his dormitory. Light conversations, jokes, everything was so sweet. But the idea of returning to his hometown had firmly taken root in Samuel's mind. And so, one autumn evening, he asked Melanie, "Will you come with me to the village?" "I will," Melanie answered without hesitation. Samuel was slightly taken aback, but then delighted. It meant he hadn't made a mistake in choosing her. She loved him if she was willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. Melanie truly loved Samuel, and she feared he might disappear. The village, however, didn't frighten her. She had grown up there. Granted, at 16 she had to leave her native village after her mother passed away. Her stepfather remained, a heavy drinker who, when intoxicated, tried to make advances toward the poor girl. So Melanie left for the city. She managed to enroll in a sewing college and even secured a spot in a dormitory. But after finishing school, she was set adrift. And where could she go? Could she find work in a big sewing factory in the city? But for peanuts. Melanie didn't want to join the underground seamstresses herself. She knew it resembled slavery. So, she chose to work in a cafe. They didn't pay millions there either, but at least she found it acceptable. Sometimes, the cooks could share unsellable products, and they generally fed the poor orphan. Melanie started as a dishwasher, then worked her way up to become a waitress. Melanie lived with an old woman not far from the cafe. Half of her earnings went toward her cramped room, but Melanie believed that someday everything in her life would change. And it did. When she met Samuel, life took on new colors. She was now ready to follow him anywhere. Emma was quite surprised to see her son with a girl. Though Samuel had hinted that someone was coming with him, his mother hadn't understood. She thought it was just a friend who had also decided to settle in the village. But as it turned out, he had arrived with a fiancée. She was so lovely, friendly, and respectful. From their very first meeting, Emma started calling Melanie her daughter. At first, Melanie blushed and felt lost. After all, she had only one mother her own. And here was this stranger. But soon, she got used to Emma, and it was as if she had become a daughter. She, too, started calling Emma Mom. In February, they had their wedding and began living together as a trio, finding happiness in each other's company. Samuel and Melanie couldn't help but wonder why they had even considered trying to live in the city. This was real life, right here in the land of rare groves amid the vast steppe. Even snowstorms brought them joy. It was not the ceaseless noise of city streets. And then came that March. Melanie was invited to work at the club. It was the only cultural venue left in the village that hadn't closed down, aside from a small shop. After all, the majority of people in the village were elderly. What kind of entertainment did they need? At least they could go to the club on March 8th or New Year's Eve. Everyone would interact, and the cultural workers would organize celebrations for the kids. All of it from the heart. In the village, there were about 10 kids, which was quite a number for their small community. In the morning, they would run to the vehicle that took them to the neighboring village for school, and in the evening, when they returned, they hurried to the club, where they learned new dances, poems, and songs. In the past, Agatha, their artistic director, used to work with them, but not for long. Her son took her away to the city. Oh, how worried the villagers were at the time. They were afraid the club would close. Then, someone remembered Melanie. They had heard her sing at her own wedding, and Melanie did sing really well. They spoke with her, then informed the regional authorities that they had a ready worker. Approval was granted. Hiring a worker for the pay they used to give the artistic director was easier than closing down the club. After all, even if it closed, they would still have to look after the building. Melanie agreed joyfully. After all, she used to perform in her village in her childhood, and if the pay was modest, it didn't matter. They had their own garden. Her husband was good. They would manage. Emma was also happy for her daughter-in-law. She was an important figure in the village, a cultural worker, and Samuel didn't object. Why should Melanie stay home all day? Let her work if she wants to. As for Samuel, he got a job with the same farmer, Tristan. Tristan was pleased to have a competent guy in his operation. Samuel didn't drink, and he knew his way around machinery. Tristan even gave Samuel his own best tractor, a 4-in-1. The cab even had air conditioning. Samuel was flattered by the trust. Moreover, he had influence among the other mechanics. Seeing that he was knowledgeable about machinery, they were always eager to ask him questions, both work-related and not. Samuel helped, repaired, and gave advice. He was always ready to lend a hand. Yes, spring was harmonious and swift. March flew by unnoticed. April had arrived and begun counting the days. The snow had melted. There was no rain. The sun was shining. The land was drying out, demanding attention. The men hadn't even had a chance to look around, and it was already time to head to the fields. The land had rested for several years, but a lot of work awaited it. They knew their trade well, including Samuel. He would head to the fields in the morning and stay there until late at night. One morning, Melanie woke up first, feeling an unexplainable sense of unease, as if someone had pulled her shoulder. She opened her eyes and saw Samuel sleeping peacefully beside her, and Emma in her own room. Melanie let out a sigh, dismissing her worries, and snuggled up to her husband. He was so dear to her. A wave of tenderness engulfed her. How happy she was that life had brought her to Samuel, one and only, forever. Melanie cautiously kissed the warm tip of Samuel's nose and thought, he's still asleep and doesn't know anything. The young woman smiled. Yes, today she would definitely tell him. Melanie hugged her husband a little tighter and practically purred with delight, imagining his joy. Yes, they would have a baby, absolutely. Yesterday morning, Melanie had been to the district polyclinic where they confirmed everything. Samuel returned late from the field, so she decided to share the news with him in the morning. Samuel opened his eyes, smiled, and said, "Melanie, are you already awake? Why so early? Go back to sleep, sweetheart." He hugged his wife, and in his embrace, she fell asleep sweetly. Samuel quietly got up and went to the kitchen. On the table, prepared by Melanie since the evening, was his breakfast, his favorite pancakes, covered with a white cloth. The kettle started to hum, and Melanie jumped up upon hearing its sound. She had almost overslept sending her husband to the fields. No, that's just how he was. He would gather his things quietly, grab the bag with the food Melanie had prepared the night before, and head off to work without wanting to wake his wife. He didn't realize that accompanying him was a joy for her. and today she had to share the most important news. Samuel would find out, and he would work with joy all day. Melanie had just gotten out of bed when she suddenly heard the barking of a dog in the yard and men's voices. The young woman looked out the window with concern and gasped. The faintly dawning light was obscured by milky white mist. Or was it smoke? Melanie even thought she smelled smoke. Through the yard, Tristan and Tyler, one of the mechanics, were quickly heading towards the house. Samuel also heard the early visitors and hurried outside. They conversed about something on the porch, and Samuel returned to the house, rushing to get ready. "What's going on?" Melanie asked anxiously, peeking out from the bedroom. "The fields are on fire," Samuel quickly replied. "The fire isn't close to us yet, but with this wind, it might be here soon. We need to put out the fire urgently." Melanie was taken aback, imagining the disaster that fire could cause. "Oh no," she murmured, fearing the extent of the damage. "Come on, dear," Samuel said, smiling warmly. "Don't worry, we'll beat this fire in no time." "Where did it come from?" "The guys say it came from the neighboring region." "Samuel, please be careful." Emma's voice came from behind. She had also woken up and hurried to her son. "Don't be too reckless." "Did you call the fire brigade?" "We did, but it'll take some time for them to arrive," Samuel said, waving his hand in frustration. Then he smiled. "All right, my beloved girls, I have to go." "Take care of yourself," Melanie whispered. Melanie stood at the doorway, watching as Samuel hurried toward the men. A sense of unease gripped her heart. Maybe it was because she hadn't told Samuel the most important news. Well, he would find out when he returned home. Melanie went back inside. "He didn't even have time to drink tea," she lamented as she entered the kitchen. "And he must be hungry." "He's always like that," Emma sighed. "As soon as something happens, he rushes to help." "Well, hopefully, they'll have it under control in an hour or so. Maybe Tristan will let them take a break, although probably not." Both women fell silent, a mysterious sense of unease settling over them, like an inner web of worry. By that time, the smoke had thickened to the point where breathing was becoming difficult. The steppe fire had approached the nearest area from the village. Branches crackled at the edge of the forest, a thick cushion of fallen leaves ignited, and birds that had already settled into their nests remained hidden. They would perish, but they wouldn't abandon their offspring. Other members of their kin circled frantically above the forest, emitting desperate cries, and it was terrifying. Pain and fear echoed in their chorus of voices. The men rushed to extinguish the fire with shovels, forks, and rags. Soon, they brought a barrel of water, and progress quickened. Samuel, on his tractor, plowed the forested field that bordered the village. Suddenly, cries of alarm echoed as a fiery column surged from the field toward the lake. It seemed the fire had slithered like a snake through the grass before gathering strength and erupting with the wind's force. Soon, it could jump onto the reeds, and then, that wouldn't be good. The lake would catch fire. There were so many reeds, and birds nested in them. They wouldn't be able to escape their nests. They would all perish. Observing this disaster, Samuel accelerated and sped forward to intercept the fire, creating a barrier. The other men followed suit. Everyone fought the fire, while also expressing frustration at the fire brigade. Why are they taking so long? Why aren't they coming to help? Only after they suppressed the fire, pushing it away from the lake, did the long-awaited sound of sirens echo in the distance. The firefighters finished the work the men had started, filed reports, and then left. The men started to recover a little from the ordeal. That was quite a morning workout they had. But they had saved the lake, and the forest was mostly intact. Of course, there would be further observations, but the main task was accomplished. The men thought that Tristan would allow them to head home, rest, change clothes, have a bite to eat. They all sat at the edge of the forest, recovering from the events, talking amongst themselves. But the farmer had a different plan. He walked over and immediately gave a command. "We need to finish the watering on the far field. No more slacking off. Get to work, men." One of the workers requested a couple of hours for rest. However, the owner was adamant. The land was drying out, and everything needed to be done on time. If someone didn't like it, they were free to leave. Just don't expect any compensation. "Come on, guys," Samuel was the first to stand up. He headed toward his tractor. Why waste time? The sooner we start, the sooner we'll finish. The field was enormous. They all worked together, and yet they managed to finish when the sun was setting. Everyone was utterly exhausted, including Samuel. He returned home on his tractor, struggling to keep his eyes open. He drove along an old dirt road that ran alongside the forest and led to the village. How did he not notice that pipe? A small rusty piece had just pushed up from the ground after winter. No one knew how it got there now. Samuel was just too tired, and he was in a hurry to get home to his beloved wife, a delicious dinner prepared by his mother. At full speed, he collided with the obstacle. The tractor, hitting the obstruction, swerved to the side, and there was a steep slope ahead. In a matter of seconds, the tractor tilted onto its side and then tumbled off the road. Bernard, who was following Samuel, witnessed the whole incident. He jumped out of his tractor and rushed to help his friend. The tractor lay on its side, and Samuel was inside. He was badly bruised, and fragments had wounded him. Blood was flowing profusely, and he had lost consciousness. Other men quickly arrived, pulled Samuel out, but he remained unconscious. Tristan approached, and his first glance was toward the tractor. He grimaced when he saw what had happened to his beauty. Then he looked at the worker. "Tristan," Bernard shouted to him, "we need to get Samuel to the hospital urgently. Use your Jeep. We'll put him on the back seat." "Why the Jeep?" The owner unexpectedly responded, his tone cold. "Call an ambulance." "But by the time the ambulance arrives, Samuel might die," the men shouted in chorus. "He'll stain my car with blood," Tristan said. "Are you going to clean it up later? You've wrecked the tractor, and now you want to mess up my car." Tristan jumped into his Jeep, shouted that he had called an ambulance, and drove off. However, the ambulance took a while to arrive, and Samuel remained unconscious. The men considered carrying Samuel on the tractor, but that would only make his condition worse due to the rough road. Finally, they heard the distant sound of a siren. They sighed with relief, believing they'd managed to save Samuel. Melanie learned what had happened to Samuel from Bernard. He arrived looking frightened and shared the whole story. Young wife's eyes darkened, and her legs almost gave way. Bernard barely managed to catch her. "Come on, what's wrong?" he said anxiously. "Everything will be fine. You'll see." The doctor from the ambulance said they'll give him a blood transfusion, and he'll recover. "I need to go to him," Melanie whispered. "I need to be there. It's already night time." "Go rest, Melanie, and don't say anything to Emma for now. Her heart might not handle it." Melanie sighed heavily. She didn't need to say anything. From the corridor, they heard a scream, followed by the sound of a falling body. Bernard and Melanie rushed into the house, finding Emma on the floor. She had overheard the conversation between her daughter-in-law and Bernard. Melanie helped her mother-in-law come to her senses, led her to a room, and then they sat together, silent, lost in their thoughts. They only wished for Samuel to recover. Melanie dialed the number of the surgical department at the district hospital. "Miss, it's 6 a.m. Why are you calling so early?" A displeased female voice answered. "I'm sorry," Melanie mumbled. "I just wanted to inquire about Samuel's condition after the accident. They brought him to you yesterday evening." The voice on the other end fell silent. "Are you there? Hello?" Melanie raised her voice. "Miss, call after 9 when the doctors are present," the respondent said. "All right, I'll call then. Can you at least tell me if he's regained consciousness?" She received no response. Short beeps sounded from the other end. Emma peeked into the room. "What did the doctors say?" she asked softly. "They said everything is normal," Melanie lied. "The doctors will tell us more after 9. The main thing is that he's alive." Emma sighed. "Alive," Melanie repeated. About half an hour later, she hurried to the bus stop. Melanie had decided to go to the hospital after all. She needed to talk to the doctors, and perhaps she could see her husband too. The bus stop was located beyond the village, about 2 kilometers away from the village itself, along the highway. This decision had been made by the local authorities some time ago, and now, regardless of the weather, the few villagers had to travel nearly 2 kilometers to reach the district center. Fortunately, on that May morning, it was warm. Spring was in the air, and nature was fragrant and joyful. The morning sun, bathed in dew, seemed to smile warmly and generously. Melanie's heart also warmed. The anxiety had subsided a bit. For some reason, she believed that everything would be fine. As she approached the bus stop, a jeep caught up with her. Tristan looked out from the window and offered her a ride. At first, Melanie wanted to decline. She had already experienced how the farmer had treated her yesterday. But then she thought that perhaps he had come to his senses. He was sure to arrive in comfort, which was the most important thing. Given her condition, she needed to take care of herself, and the bus ride was too shaky. On the way, Tristan inquired about Samuel and Emma. Then, as they neared the hospital, he suddenly said to Melanie, "Yeah, let Samuel recover there. He's responsible for the mess now. That tractor is on his conscience." "What do you mean?" Melanie was puzzled. "Exactly that. When I hired him, he signed a document saying he's responsible for the equipment's safety, and now he practically wrecked the tractor. So, Melanie, he'll have to compensate me for the damage. The repairs will cost around $20,000. $20,000. Melanie's face went pale. "Where are we supposed to get that kind of money? You know we live very modestly." "That's your concern. Once he's out of the hospital, your husband can figure out how he'll repay me. Let him take out a loan. I'm not concerned. He owes me the money." "How can you say that?" Melanie protested. "You practically provoked this situation yourself. I heard that you didn't let the men rest after the fire. They worked tirelessly all day, and when Samuel had his accident, you didn't even offer any help." "I'm not a doctor," the farmer smirked. "Besides, others helped him. What more do you want from me?" "Well, let him recover." Melanie got out of the car without thanking the driver, and once again, her heart was gripped by heavy forebodings. What else was in store? She entered the reception area, feeling nervous, and glanced around helplessly. "Can I help you with something, miss?" A security guard approached her, giving her a questioning look. "I need to inquire about the patient's condition," she replied. "Then talk to the duty nurse." The guy nodded sympathetically and led her to a small office. Behind the desk sat a woman of considerable size, enjoying a smoked chicken with gusto. For some reason, Melanie felt uncomfortable at the sight. An unpleasant wave of nausea hit her. The woman noticed her and quickly wiped her mouth, finishing the last bite, then asked her, "What do you need? Hospitalization?" "No, I'd like to know how Samuel is doing. He was brought here yesterday after the accident." "Why did you come here?" The nurse raised an eyebrow, closing the container with the chicken. "Call the surgery department." "That's what I did, but they told me to call back later. But you see, I can't just sit and wait." "What's there to wait for?" The nurse muttered indifferently. "Your Samuel died. They've already taken him to the morgue." "How did he die?" Melanie whispered. Her vision darkened, and she couldn't remember anything else. The girl woke up from a sharp smell. That same nurse was literally shoving cotton wool soaked in ammonia under her nose. Melanie was lying on a couch in that very office. "Well, you're awake," the nurse said with satisfaction. "Zoe, leave the girl alone. I'll take care of her. You can go home now." Another voice, somewhat annoyed and sharp, sounded. Melanie immediately saw another woman in a white coat. She was probably a little older than Melanie herself. The woman asked how she was feeling, helped Melanie to sit up, and then they went outside to get some fresh air. "I apologize for my colleague's lack of tact." Zoe blurted out without thinking. "Can you really announce such things so easily?" The girl explained. "It's probably professional burnout. You stop feeling other people's pain. But that certainly doesn't excuse her." "Forgive me, so it's true. Samuel passed away?" Melanie asked, and tears streamed from her eyes. "Unfortunately, yes. I can't provide you with any details. Let's calm down a bit, and I'll take you to the doctor." Just then, someone called the girl. Her demeanor instantly changed. She spoke on the phone while casting glances at Melanie. "Who are you to Samuel?" she asked after the call. "I'm his wife. The chief doctor invites you for a conversation. Let's go. I'll show you the way." Melanie scarcely comprehended where they were taking her. She didn't hear the words of comfort. How was this possible? Just yesterday, Samuel had been there, alive and well. and then he slipped away and disappeared. Melanie could still see him leaving the yard, disappearing into the haze of the approaching fire. Oh, if only she had known yesterday. She would have stopped him, not let him go, and let everyone judge her later. But could you really turn back time? In the chief doctor's office, she was greeted by a short man in a white coat. He embraced the girl's shoulders, led her to a soft armchair, and the secretary brought a glass of water. The chief doctor took a seat next to her and gently squeezed Melanie's hands in his. "Stay strong, dear. This is how it all happened. Yes, death doesn't ask when to come, and we doctors, unfortunately, are not gods." "What happened?" Melanie barely audibly asked. "I was told that the doctor from the ambulance promised they would save Samuel, and this morning, the ward told me everything was fine. The ambulance doctor couldn't make any certain claims, and the person in the ward who spoke to you this morning was a trainee. She had no right to convey such information. We were planning to call you later, but you came on your own. Please forgive the nurse at the reception for her tactlessness. We'll reprimand her." "So what happened?" Melanie repeated her question. The doctor sighed, paused as if gathering his thought, and then explained that Samuel had been brought in with significant internal bleeding. Initially, they had planned to perform a diagnostic surgery, but even before it began, his condition deteriorated, and he passed away on the operating table. It all happened very quickly. There was nothing they could do to help him. I just received a call from the pathologist, and she informed me that a blood clot was to blame. The extensive bleeding triggered its movement. The clot blocked a vessel, leading to instant death, the doctor said. "Please understand, we were powerless in this situation." Melanie listened silently, crying, while the doctor continued to speak, gently squeezing her hand. He then offered her a sedative injection. "I probably shouldn't have it." Melanie remembered her condition. "I'm pregnant." "Oh, I see." The doctor nodded, sighed heavily. "You poor girl. Well, you need to stay strong, especially now. Try to prioritize thinking about the little one, and that way the trouble will ease a bit." Afterwards, he inquired about how Melanie had arrived at the hospital and offered her the use of a hospital vehicle to get home. Melanie nodded in agreement. She had no energy to go to the bus station. "Try to get some rest," he advised, gently helping Melanie into the hospital vehicle. "When you get home, get some sleep, and then, once some time has passed, don't forget to register with our women's consultation service." The doctor was quite caring. He genuinely sympathized with Melanie and seemed to be doing everything he could to alleviate her pain even slightly. "And Samuel, when can I pick him up?" Melanie remembered to ask while already in the car. "His body can be picked up from the morgue after lunch today, and all the documents will be ready. Is there anyone else to help you with the funeral arrangements?" The chief doctor gently touched her hand. "You don't have to handle everything on your own. Samuel only had his elderly mother left." Melanie sobbed. "There's no one else." "Well, I see. You're still trying to hold yourself together." Saying this, the chief doctor closed the car door and briskly walked back to the hospital. Melanie watched him go and had a thought in her mind. What a good doctor. Not like that plump woman from the reception. What's the chief doctor's name? She never asked. Or did he mention it, and she just didn't remember? But what does it matter what his name is? Throughout the drive back to the village, Melanie quietly cried. The driver remained silent, staring grimly at the road. Emma was waiting by the house. The old woman leaned on a gnarled stick instead of a cane, waiting to hear what her daughter-in-law would say. From her appearance, the mother instantly sensed that something terrible had happened, and when Melanie finally spoke, "Samuel passed away." Emma collapsed, her mother's heart unable to bear the news. Emma collapsed, her maternal heart unable to bear the news. Bernard took care of all the funeral arrangements for Samuel and Emma. Everyone helped with money, except Tristan. As soon as he learned that Samuel had passed away, he stormed into Melanie's house, shouting that now she had to repay the debt for the tractor repair. The poor woman couldn't muster a response. She could only sob uncontrollably. What kind of repair could she possibly be talking about now, when she had lost both her husband and her mother-in-law, who was like a mother to her? But Tristan persisted, threatening legal action. Then came the funerals, the memorial services. Melanie remembered very little. Thanks to the neighbors, and to all the other villagers, they supported her as best they could. How the young woman endured all of this was difficult to imagine. How she managed not to lose her baby due to the stress was also hard to fathom. Perhaps it was precisely this tiny life that had just begun inside Melanie that gave her strength. But it was so bitter and painful. She hadn't even had a chance to tell her husband that they were going to have a child. There wasn't enough time, and Emma never got to be pleased with the news. Now they would watch over them as angels on earth. Some time passed, and the pain eased a little. Life had to go on. Melanie thought for a long time about what to do next. Maybe she should leave the village. But where to? Her stepfather wouldn't welcome her return, and she didn't want to go back to her hometown either. Besides, there was no other place on earth for her besides this village where she could find shelter from all the adversities and peacefully give birth to her baby. And only the heartless Tristan showed up almost every day, reminding her of the debt. Melanie genuinely didn't understand why she should pay anything. Once, she even tried to threaten the former that she would involve the police, to which he simply laughed. "You'll report it to the police. Go ahead. My son-in-law is in charge there. They'll deal with you swiftly. By the way, where did you even come from in our paths? Maybe you ran away from your city, and who knows what you might have been up to there." "What nonsense are you talking about?" Melanie was outraged. "Maybe it's nonsense, but my son-in-law will find something to pin on you, so sit quietly and don't make a fuss, and find the money," Tristan replied. And then he somehow showed up at her place at the end of May. "I've been thinking," he said, lounging comfortably in Emma's favorite armchair. "I have a proposal." "What is it?" Melanie asked cautiously. "You have something that can please me," the farmer chuckled crudely. "In short, you'll work off your husband's debt." "Are you completely out of your mind?" Melanie gasped. "Get out of my house." "Listen, don't resist. I'm the boss here. This is my land, my village. What I want will happen, and if you go against me, your house might suddenly catch fire. It happens. A faulty wire and all that." Tristan smirked shamelessly. "Agree, I like ye. Although you seem to have put on some weight." "Have you no shame?" Melanie said, choking with indignation. "Leave. If you don't want to do it the easy way, we'll do it the hard way." Tristan stood up and approached her. Melanie pressed herself against the wall. The farmer grabbed her and pushed her onto the couch. "Please, no, don't," she cried out. "I'm pregnant." Wow, Tristan was taken aback. "Why didn't you say anything about this? No one in the village knows. Isn't Samuel the child, by any chance?" "Well, it doesn't matter to me. Your condition won't hinder me at all." It's uncertain how all of this would have ended, but just at that moment, Melanie Bernard happened to pass by the house. The young man jumped over the fence without hesitation, rushed into the house, and with a powerful blow, sent the farmer flying to the far corner of the room. "You scoundrel," Tristan muttered, rubbing his bruised jaw. "You both will answer for this. Mark my words. You, Bernard, will pay for this assault tomorrow. I'll file a report against you," Melanie shouted tearfully. "Write whatever you want, you fool," the farmer retorted before leaving the house and slamming the door. Melanie and Bernard sat together for a long while, contemplating their next steps. As promised, Bernard had already stopped working for the farmer. He now commuted to the district center every day and found a job at a wood processing plant. The rest of the men continued to toil under Tristan. Bernard understood that, even in this situation, everyone would stay silent and not support Melanie, not because they wouldn't believe her, but simply because they were afraid of losing their means of survival. "Melanie, what if we move to the district center?" Bernard suggested, "far away from that scoundrel. We could rent an apartment and start new together." Melanie liked Bernard, and lately, he had been mustering the courage to talk to her. Now, an opportunity presented itself. "Thank you, Bernard, but I can't do that. Understand, I don't love you in that way. You're a very good friend, and that's all. I love Samuel, but he's not around anymore. You still have to live your life. I'm pregnant." Bernard, upon hearing this, looked at Melanie in surprise, then suddenly knelt before her and whispered, "Melanie, dear, this is wonderful news. Samuel will have a son. I'll accept him as my own." raise him, and never blame you for anything. Trust me. Bernard, you're kind. I'm sorry, but I can't do that. Understand me." Bernard stood up from his knees, sighed, and nodded in response. At the doorway, he turned around and said, "I understand everything, and you forgive me. And know that I'll always help you. Just tell me, and don't worry about Tristan. I think I know how to calm him down." And he left. Melanie locked the doors and couldn't sleep all night. She wondered what would happen next. It was a bit uncomfortable how she had treated Bernard, but she had been honest. She didn't love him that way. You can't command your heart, after all. "It's all right, my little one. We'll manage," she whispered, caressing her slightly noticeable belly. "Everything will be fine. Mom is with you, and Dad and Grandma up there in the heavens are watching over us. They are always with us." And the next evening, the farmer returned. Seeing him, Melanie turned pale in horror. Could yesterday's events be repeating? "Well, here's the deal," Tristan said sternly. "I won't touch you anymore. Just live your life, but try not to show up in front of me." He turned and left, leaving Melanie in complete bewilderment. What was that? Why did the farmer suddenly change his attitude? Little did she know that it was all Bernard's doing. In every somewhat sizable town, there are its own power players, and they are far from law-abiding citizens. Strangely enough, they enjoy respect and favor with the local authorities, and the police leave them be. It's because these fellows serve as both benefactors and sponsors and help the police locate small-time crooks. There was such a figure in that district. That's who Bernard reached out to. Caleb was older, had been to prison a few times. Now, settled in the distant district center, he dealt in selling fruits and vegetables. He had a few market stalls, and on the side, he did good deeds and resolved conflicts that people were afraid to take to the police. Bernard got in touch with him through the sawmill owner, explaining the situation. "It seems this woman means a lot to you if you're putting in such effort," the owner remarked. "Very much so. Her husband was my friend. She's alone now, pregnant, and this old goat thinks he can do whatever he wants," Bernard replied. The owner was a perceptive and fair man. He immediately contacted Caleb, and within an hour, Bernard was with him. Despite his dubious past, for the old Azerbaijani, family and children were the most important values. Therefore, he agreed to help calm down the raging farmer. After Bernard left, Caleb called the police chief. "Listen, Carl," Caleb said after greetings, small talk about the weather, and personal matters. "A young man came to me complaining about your father-in-law." He described what Tristan was doing. The police chief wasn't exactly ignorant about what was happening, but he preferred to turn a blind eye to it. The police chief promised to give his father-in-law a talking to, and soon Tristan found himself in his son-in-law's office. The specifics of their conversation remain unknown, but the farmer emerged from the office as red as a lobster. Later, he went home and had a talk with Melanie. He promised not to touch her, and he kept his word. Melanie breathed a sigh of relief. She could hardly believe that there wouldn't be any more upheavals, and that's exactly how it turned out. She lived calmly, regularly visited the maternity clinic, and prepared to become a mother. Bernard occasionally visited her, but they remained friends. Bernard never brought up the idea of Melanie being with him again. He understood that the young woman's heart was closed to him, yet he truly loved her. Bernard helped Melanie around the house. In August, he brought her firewood, coal, and repaired the roof a little. In general, life went on its course. Over time, the incident of a patient's death on the operating table in the district hospital began to fade from memory. Well, that happens sometimes. Moreover, in that case, the doctors were not to blame. All documents confirmed that. Only the young surgeon knew the truth behind it all. He knew and remained silent because there was nothing he could change. Calvin was born and raised in this district center. He had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood, but he realized his chances were slim. He came from a simple family. His mother was a technician in a store, and his father was a bus driver. His parents couldn't afford to send him to a paid medical school. Going to medical school for free was like flying to space, an unattainable dream. But Calvin had a friend, Earl. They were in the same class. Earl was a chronic C student, a perpetual troublemaker. He'd pick fights, and Calvin would end up fighting for him. What choice did he have? Earl was his friend. Teachers never scolded Earl. How could they? His parents were highly respected in the district. His father was the chief doctor at the hospital, and his mother was a colleague, a teacher of primary classes. Meanwhile, Calvin was regularly summoned to the principal's office to explain who he had fought with this time, why he had broken a window or disrupted a lesson. Of course, Calvin didn't break windows or ring the bell in the hallway. Earl did those things. Well, you wouldn't rat out your friend. So Calvin remained silent. Then he would get in trouble, receiving reprimands from teachers and reproaches from his parents. His parents understood it all and scolded him for covering up his friend. Calvin just insisted, friends don't betray each other. With time, such incidents became fewer. Earl calmed down, and Calvin became a diligent student. In the 11th grade, when the question of future profession arose, Calvin honestly told his teachers he dreamed of becoming a surgeon. He studied well, so he could try. Teachers only shrugged in confusion. It would be tough to get in. Looking at his friend, Earl also declared he would become a doctor. His teachers supported him. Weren't you going to become a lawyer? Calvin wondered. Or is it your dad's insistence? It's not about my dad, Earl admitted. I just thought we should stick together further. We're friends, after all. Friends, Calvin agreed, though I doubt I'll get in. We'll both get in, you'll see. Earl winked at him. Soon, Calvin and his parents were called to the chief doctor's office, and Earl's father, Edward, offered to direct Calvin to medical school. It was much easier with him, and the hospital promised to cover the tuition fees. Of course, Calvin's parents happily agreed. Needless to say, Earl received the exact same arrangement. The two boys were admitted. Calvin confidently passed his exams, while Earl barely made it, but they both secured spots outside the competition due to their targeted direction, and soon their college life began. They lived in the same dorm room, studied in the same group. As the years passed, Earl grew more serious, delving into his studies. However, his studies came with difficulty, unlike Calvin, who grasped everything quickly. Calvin even helped Earl with essays and whispered hints during exams. By the time the boys had to choose their specializations, they were among the best students. One followed his dream and pursued the intricacies of surgery, while the other delved into anesthesiology. Earl's father often visited the institute, inquiring about his son's studies, and it was evident that his success was rewarded materially. But nobody complained, neither the professors nor Earl himself. Calvin, on the other hand, studied independently. He achieved everything through his own head and hands. The years of education flew by unnoticed. There was no need to worry about finding jobs. In short, the boys returned in high spirits. Calvin's mood was slightly dampened when he was denied official housing as a young specialist. He continued to live with his elderly parents. As for Earl, he was immediately given a 2-bedroom apartment in a new building in the center of the settlement. It didn't matter that his parents owned a 2-story mansion. Calvin was slightly hurt by this, but he didn't show it. He understood that living in his parents' house would allow him to help them around the house more. Besides, he could keep an eye on their health. And Earl, well, there was no comparison. The chief doctor would do anything for his son. And so, the working days began. It turned out that the workload in the surgical department was substantial. Despite being a small town, people had all sorts of problems. Calvin performed both simple and more complex surgeries. He wasn't afraid of challenges. But Earl was afraid. Luckily for him, he had a partner in the department, an anesthesiologist named Gerald, who was already an experienced doctor. Meanwhile, Calvin was the only surgeon. The workload was immense, but Calvin was not one to complain, especially since another surgeon was expected to join the team soon. He would manage, endure. On that spring evening, an ambulance brought in a young man after a car accident. They said his tractor had overturned. He had multiple bruises, fractures, and suspected internal bleeding. Urgent diagnosis was required. Calvin immediately notified the chief doctor. It might require medical aviation. This is a severe case. Edward was in high spirits that evening. He was celebrating his wife's anniversary at a restaurant with numerous guests. The chief doctor listened to the young doctor and said, "Don't panic prematurely. Let's try to handle it ourselves first. We'll see how it goes." There was another complication. On that very evening, the anesthesiologist Gerald fell ill with a hypertensive crisis and was lying in the adjacent ward on foredrip. Earl needed to be called in urgently. The chief doctor became tense. "Let Gerald go and work. He has a blood pressure of 220/180. How can he work?" objected Calvin. "Send him to the hospital. Give him medical treatment. He already drank alcohol." "But how come?" Calvin protested. "He knew earlier today that Gerald wasn't feeling well. I asked him not to drink, to be on standby." "Why are you getting so worked up, Calvin?" Edward smirked. "I'm the chief doctor, and I make the decisions about who gets time off and who works. Earl has earned his day off." "He gets a day off, and I don't even know what that is," Calvin snapped. "But that's not important now. Someone might die. In that case, call for medical aviation immediately. An urgent surgery is needed." "Fine. Earl will come now." "But he's been drinking." "Well, he had half a glass of wine. I'm allowing it." Soon, Earl arrived at the hospital, moody, angry, and quite intoxicated. "In this state, you'll administer anesthesia," Calvin exclaimed. "I won't allow it." "I can't understand you," Earl smirked, preparing for the surgery. "First, you ask for an anesthesiologist, then you don't. Do it yourself. Do whatever you want." And he was about to leave the department when the chief doctor himself appeared, equally angry and intoxicated. "You ruined the whole celebration." He shot a malicious glance and said to Calvin, "Medical aviation. Do you know how much that costs?" "But the case is serious," Calvin objected. "We'll figure it out." "Earl, get to work on the patient right away," commanded the chief doctor, then turned to Calvin. "And you, go prepare for the surgery." Calvin understood that he was caught in a dilemma. On one hand, the patient needed urgent help, but on the other hand, how could a colleague be allowed to work while under the influence? Ultimately, the chief doctor was responsible for everything at the moment. Calvin went to the operating room. The young man was already on the table, and Earl administered anesthesia. "Go ahead and cut him," Earl smirked. "He's out cold anyway." "You fool," Calvin simply said to him. "Look at the vital signs." Suddenly, the equipment emitted an unpleasant squeal. The patient's heart had stopped. All resuscitation measures were performed, but they couldn't revive the heart. Afterward, when Calvin sat in despair on the floor, right in front of the surgical table, the chief doctor entered the operating room. He glanced at his son, who was dozing by the window, and then turned his anger toward Calvin. "This is your fault," the doctor hissed. "You killed the patient." The nurse, who had been present the whole time, couldn't stay silent any longer and stood up in defense of the surgeon. Calvin hadn't even done anything when the heart stopped. "I can confirm that." "Confirming, are you?" the chief doctor said slowly. "That's good. But overall, I suggest everyone keep quiet. The patient died because a clot detached." "Do you know that without an autopsy?" Calvin asked wearily and turned his gaze to Earl. "I think there might have been an anesthesia mistake." Shut up, the chief doctor hissed. "If you want to stay in this profession, don't even think such things. My son is not at fault, understand? And if you resist, you'll be blamed for everything, including your nurse. Do you want to test whether it works?" And he left, taking his son with him. Calvin sat next to the deceased patient, staring blankly ahead. "Ruth, this is my first death," he said slowly. "You can't imagine how heavy it is, and it's even harder to realize that this could have been avoided. But do you think it will come out?" The nurse sighed. "He has connections in the regional ministry. Calvin, let's keep quiet. After all, we didn't really do anything. If it does get exposed, it'll be without us. Otherwise, we won't have a life." "Do you think it will be uncovered?" Calvin smirked. "The pathologist will write what's needed. You've already figured that out. How can I continue working here?" "Just work and keep quiet." Calvin nodded wearily in response, and the secret never left the boundaries of the surgical department. The relatives of the deceased young man believed the doctors, and no one investigated the situation. Well, a patient died. It happens. Unfortunately, every doctor has their own small cemetery. Calvin continued his work in the department. His friendship with Earl had come to an abrupt end. Besides, Earl didn't seem particularly bothered, neither by the loss of a friend nor by the young man who died on the operating table. He continued working as before, and by the end of the summer, he was awarded some commendation for being an excellent specialist. Gerald, having recovered from his illness, returned to the department. Of course, he knew everything, but he kept silent as well. He only whispered to Calvin once, "Don't fret so much. Someday, they'll be held accountable for everything. In the meantime, just do your job. I'll always be by your side." And indeed, in all complicated cases afterwards, Gerald was there to assist. As for Earl, despite all the awards and honors, he treated his work carelessly. But no one dared to say a word, as dealing with the chief doctor was more costly than it was worth. In September, unexpectedly, Earl was preparing for a trip to the mountains. His father had found him a better position within the ministry. Edward understood that his son needed to be hidden, removed. What if that incident resurfaced one day? But with Earl gone, everyone would forget. Soon, Henry arrived to replace Earl, a serious man who had previously worked in a military hospital, and with him came his wife, Barbara, also a surgeon. Barbara was a skilled specialist. Calvin breathed a sigh of relief. He could finally relax a little. He had been under constant pressure from being on call and performing surgeries. He realized he was close to losing his mind. Calvin even became friends with Henry and Barbara. The couple invited him over, sharing interesting cases from their practice. Calvin was amazed how could two doctors with such experience end up in this village. "We needed money," Barbara honestly admitted, "and we wanted to take a break. Things are easier in the local hospital. Easier when you have assistants." Calvin chuckled. "Well, now you have me," Barbara laughed, "and in general, I like it here. I just can't figure out who your chief doctor really is. He seems so proper, polite, and smiles to your face, but you can feel you need to be cautious around him." "You understand correctly." Calvin nodded and said nothing more. The couple exchanged glances. There was another reason why Henry and Barbara had come here. Henry's elderly mother lived in the distant village. He had tried countless times to persuade her to move in with him and Barbara, but it was futile. His mother insisted she wouldn't leave her ancestral home, so they decided to move closer to her. One day, in early October, Agatha called Henry to complain that her stove was producing too much smoke. Henry was off that day, and Barbara didn't have any duties either. Leaving his wife with their 12-year-old daughter, he drove to the village. It turned out that the stove was perfectly fine. It was just that the elderly woman had used too much coal and blocked the chimney. This led Henry to initiate the conversation again. "Mom, come live with us." But his mother just waved him off. With no other choice, Henry got into his car to drive to the district center, only to find that the engine wouldn't start. Leaving this remote village, with only 7 yards in total, via any other form of transportation was problematic, and he had to go to work tomorrow morning. Henry tried to call a taxi, but local drivers refused to venture into such remote areas on the paved roads, regardless of the payment. It was also wet outside, and who wanted to wash a car afterwards? That's when Henry called Calvin. "I can come over. I'll take you to the service station." Calvin agreed, "But I'm on duty." "What if Barbara substitutes for you? Our daughter can stay with her. She's not that young anymore." Henry asked hopefully. "I honestly don't know what to do." Calvin agreed, and so, at 7 in the evening, he set off from the district center. The one-way journey should have taken about an hour. Calvin calculated that he should return by around 10 p.m. The road from the district center was smooth, however, the asphalt soon gave way to gravel, causing the car to rattle. Cursing the local roads, Calvin pressed on. He passed through a small village and turned in its direction. This route would get him to the place where Henry's mother lived more quickly. It was then that he spotted a young woman walking towards the village. Carefully navigating around puddles, she cradled her large belly. Calvin decided to stop. "Miss, let me give you a ride," he offered, opening the door. "Get in the car." "Thank you," the stranger said hesitantly, "but I'd better walk." I don't want to mess up the carpets in your car. She motioned to her boots, covered in mud. I'll clean it up. Calvin smiled. Get in. How does your husband allow you to be out like this in your condition? The woman didn't respond. She sighed and then nodded, cautiously taking a seat in the car. Where are you walking from so late? Calvin asked as they set off. I got off the bus. I had an appointment at the clinic today, she replied. Yes, your journey isn't easy. Calvin shook his head. His passenger remained silent, only nodding in response. Soon, they reached the old house the woman had indicated. She thanked him, got out, and headed towards the yard. Calvin drove on, but after a few meters, he realized something had happened to the tire. He pulled over, got out, and inspected. The tire was punctured. Is something wrong? His recent passenger called out. She stood near the yard, watching Calvin's actions. The tire is punctured, Calvin shouted back, but it's fine. I'll fix it. He retrieved the spare tire in the jack. Soon, the job was done. Calvin placed the punctured tire in the trunk and gazed at his hands, perplexed. How was he going to clean them now? He hadn't noticed that his recent companion had approached him. Come to my house, she suggested, understanding the situation. Freshen up. Have some tea. You must be tired. Thank you, but I need to get going. Calvin replied, feeling embarrassed. My colleague is waiting for me. Well, he waited longer, and he can wait another 15 minutes. The woman smiled. Come to the house. Where are you going with such dirty hands? Yeah, I should look after my hands. Calvin agreed, smiling back. The house was simple, perhaps even too much so. Poverty seemed to permeate the air. There was an old but neatly whitewashed stove, an aging kitchen table covered in cracked oilcloth. As Calvin washed up, he realized the woman lived alone. A single toothbrush sat on the shelf, only women's shampoos. Meanwhile, the woman had boiled a kettle and fetched some jam. Try it, she smiled at Calvin. I made strawberry jam for the first time this year. Oh no, I really should get going, he replied. Please, give it a try, she almost pleaded. I need to thank you for your help somehow. All right, Calvin agreed. For some reason, he felt sorry for this sweet, very young future mother living alone in such seclusion. So, you said it's strawberry, my favorite, he said. And mine too. By the way, I'm Melanie. Calvin. He sat down at the table and took a sip of tea. Delicious tea, Calvin complimented. I can't quite place the familiar aroma. Oh, that's time. Melanie smiled. I like it too, and Samuel loved it. And where is he? Calvin cautiously asked. Why are you alone? He passed away this spring. He overturned the tractor and died in the hospital, Melanie said with bitterness, looking off to the side. Calvin followed her gaze. Melanie was looking at a photo frame on the wall near the kitchen cabinet. A small photograph was inside. Seeing who was depicted there, Calvin's hand involuntarily shook. He recognized the young man who had died due to the wrong anesthesia. Yes, Melanie had just been talking about an accident and death in the hospital, and that definitely happened in the spring. Is this your husband? Calvin asked quietly. Yes, I still can't forgive myself for letting him go that morning. Samuel didn't even know we were going to have a child, she said with a hint of sorrow. Melanie talked about the fire, the men working tirelessly, the accident. Calvin listened, not knowing where to look. He felt uncomfortable about the whole situation. He could have done something for that unfortunate young man back then, but he didn't. And now, here was his widow, sharing the whole story. If only she knew to whom she was pouring tea. All this time, Calvin had blamed himself for Samuel's death. He should have called directly to the regional authorities, argued, demanded, let them sort it out later. But it could have saved the guy's life. You can't change the past, he finally said. Don't burden yourself with this. You need to focus on your child now. I am, Melanie whispered, wiping tears away. Otherwise, I'd lose my mind completely. Forgive me for sharing this unhappy story with you. You have your own matters to attend to, and I'm keeping you. Yeah, I should go. Calvin nodded absent-mindedly. You take care here, and you know what? I'll leave you my phone number. Call me if you need anything. What could happen? Well, just in case you don't feel well. I can come over. Take you to the hospital. Thank you, but I think I can handle it. I'm used to solving my own problems. Life has taught me that much. Calvin decided to write down his phone number on a piece of paper, thanked for the delicious tea and jam, and stepped outside with brisk strides. He turned around by his car and saw Melanie's slender figure through the window, embracing her massive belly. A fresh wave of shame washed over him. Throughout the journey, his mind revolved around this encounter. In the end, he resolved that he would visit her again in a few days and help with some chores around her house. Winter was approaching, and perhaps there were repairs that needed to be done. 2 days passed, and during that time, Calvin couldn't shake off the memory of meeting the unfortunate young widow. How was she doing? She was due to give birth in a month, and as he understood, she was all alone. Yes, he really wanted to visit her, yet at the same time, he felt an immense guilt towards her. After all, her husband died right before his eyes. Finally, on his rightful day off, he mustered the courage to act on his intentions. It was a Saturday, a sunny and surprisingly warm day for October. Calvin's car traversed the familiar road, and he drove more cautiously this time, remembering the punctured tire incident. And there it was, the familiar village, the old house. Calvin stopped by the gate, got out of the car, and peered into the yard. A chubby dog barked, alerting its owner. Someone was here. "Hey there, buddy. Where's your owner?" Calvin spoke and cautiously opened the gate, unsure if the dog's chain would reach the gate or not. A minute later, Melanie emerged from around the corner, holding a bucket of carrots. "Oh, hello, is that you?" Melanie seemed a bit flustered. "Visiting your friend again?" Calvin asked. "No, I have other errands today." He found himself equally flustered, then quickly regained composure. "And why are you carrying such heavy things? You're not supposed to." "Oh, it's just a small bucket," Melanie smiled, "and it's time to dig up the carrots." "Do you do this by yourself?" "Who else?" Melanie shrugged. "Next thing you'll tell me is that you dug up the potatoes yourself." "No, the neighbors helped with the potatoes. We gathered a little at a time, but I can handle the carrots by myself." "All right then, give me the bucket. Where should I put it? Do you have more?" Calvin took the bucket and looked questioningly at Melanie. Calvin didn't explain anything to her. He simply emptied the carrots where Melanie indicated. Then, he confidently strode towards the barn, only to stop in his tracks. Melanie attempted to help, but Calvin promptly assigned her another task. He brought over a small stool from near the water barrel and some buckets. "Here, sit down and sort out the big from the small ones." The buckets with large root vegetables filled up quickly. In the meantime, they chatted with Melanie. Calvin shared a childhood story with her about how he and his friend used to sneak into the school garden to pick radishes. While glancing at Melanie, sitting on the stool, Calvin noticed her face more closely. Under the sunlight, he spotted the cute, slightly visible freckles on her face. Her nose had a slight upturn, and her eyes were big, deep blue, resembling the sky. Her stubborn curly brown hair, Melanie kept ticking them back with her slender hand. She seemed delicate and graceful, like a young girl. Only her prominent belly served as a reminder that she would soon be a mother. "Melanie, can I ask you something?" Calvin paused for a moment, resting his shovel, and looked intently at the young woman. "Why are you here? You mentioned your mom. Does she live far away? Maybe you should consider going to her, especially with the baby on the way. It might be hard alone." "My mother is indeed far away." Melanie hesitated for a moment and continued, "Very far away. She passed away when I finished school. My stepfather managed to claim her house for himself. He's a terrible person. I ran away from him to the city, and then I met Samuel, but the Lord didn't grant us much time together." "I'm sorry. Is it hard for you to talk about this?" Calvin inquired. "It's all right. It's normal. What can you do if that's how it happened? And what about you? Where do you work? Here I am, talking about myself, and I don't know anything about you." Calvin hesitated. "I work at a hospital." "Are you a doctor?" "No, I'm on the administrative side. I'm in charge of fire safety." Calvin answered and started pulling out carrots with renewed vigor. Calvin didn't want to admit to Melanie that he was a surgeon, because she would surely ask about the case with Samuel. Did he perform the surgery? Then lying would become more complicated. It was easier to say he was in administration. He liked this girl and didn't want to bring up unpleasant topics. Are you married? Melanie continued asking. No. That's strange. Melanie shrugged and gave a slightly embarrassed smile. I mean, you're such a respectable man, and you're single. Haven't you found someone suitable at the hospital? There are women. Calvin chuckled. Just not the right ones. I'm looking for someone special. Still haven't found that someone. In college, I thought I did. We were friends for a long time, and she was in a parallel group. Then she thought I wasn't promising enough. She found herself a rich guy from the city. Probably married him. Understanding that she touched upon a sensitive topic, Melanie fell silent as well. When they were done with the work, Melanie invited Calvin to come inside for a snack. It's as if I knew I'd have guests today, the girl admitted. I made such a soup. They had dinner, and then he thanked the host and began to say goodbye. Calvin, I still don't understand. Why did you come here? It wasn't just to dig carrots, was it? Melanie looked into his eyes. Sorry, but I don't get it. I simply wanted to help you, and see how fortunate my visit turned out. Calvin honestly said and added, Melanie, consider me your friend. Are you okay with that? Not against it, Melanie replied, blushing slightly. That's wonderful, Calvin smiled. So here's the deal. You have my phone number. Call me anytime. I'll come over whenever I can to help you with anything around the house. They walked to the gate. They stood there, talking, when suddenly a truck sped past them on the road, spraying them with dust and then slowing down as it continued. What a jerk, Calvin cursed, brushing the dust off his jacket. Couldn't he drive a bit more slowly? He intentionally speeds up near my house. Melanie sighed. He's a farmer from our area, the one Samuel used to work for. He holds a grudge against me. Holds a grudge? Why? Calvin was surprised. Samuel crashed his new tractor. He later demanded money from me for repairs. He seemed to quiet down for a while, and now he's back. Complete idiot. He needs to be taught a lesson. Maybe he'll calm down on his own. I don't want to get involved with him anymore. All right, just call me if anything happens. Calvin waved as he got into his car. Melanie waved back. Then, watching the receding car, she thought, he's quite strange. Why did he come? A friend? No, he's definitely a good person, but it's unusual. Yesterday he was a complete stranger, and today they were working together in the garden, chatting, joking, and sharing their sorrows. Truly, in a friendly manner, and he's handsome too. Melanie, caressing her belly, walked back into the yard. Yes, a strange encounter, peculiar conversations. It's as if he wanted to tell her something else but couldn't muster the courage. Calvin was driving home with a contented smile. He really enjoyed the day. He worked, had conversations, and was further convinced that Melanie was a wonderful person. A person who now seemed not indifferent to him. 3 days later, Melanie called Calvin. He had just left the hospital and was heading home when the call came. From her voice, it was clear she was very agitated. Calvin, please tell me, do you know a veterinarian or a doctor who can help an animal? You work at the hospital, after all. What happened? Calvin stopped, realizing that something serious had occurred. Melanie was barely holding back tears. My dog's in trouble, she sobbed into the phone. At first, I thought he was just bored. He hasn't been eating. Then he started vomiting. And then our neighbor, the elderly woman who lives across the street, came over and said she saw Tristan throwing something over the fence to him last night. Looks like he poisoned him. All right, don't worry, I'll be there soon, Calvin responded shortly. On the way, he stopped by a veterinary pharmacy, bought the necessary medicines and supplies, and informed his parents that he would be coming home late. They assumed their son was on duty again and let out a heavy sigh. Meanwhile, Calvin was rushing to Melanie's place. Melanie was in the yard next to the doghouse. The dog had crawled inside and refused to come out, shivering uncontrollably and curled up tightly. Did they really poison him? He asked Melanie. The neighbor couldn't have lied, Melanie said, wiping away tears. Calvin, do you understand this? Can you help him? Calvin just nodded in response. Of course, he was a human doctor. but the reasons for illnesses were quite similar across species. Yet, how could he tell Melanie that he was a surgeon after having lied about his profession? "Melanie, I know what I'm doing," he replied shortly. "Turn on the porch light so I can see better and go inside." "But what if he bites you? He doesn't know you. In his current state, he can't even open his mouth." "Go on. I know how to handle dogs." He carefully pulled the dog on its chain out of the doghouse. The dog didn't resist. It just looked at the man with a mournful gaze. In fact, it was in such a terrible state that death would have seemed like a relief. "It looks like he really got poisoned," Calvin said, examining the dog, and he began the cautious procedures. An hour later, he entered the house. Silently, he washed his hands, dried them with a towel. Melanie was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at him with a questioning and worried expression. "Will he survive?" she finally asked. "I can't say for sure right now," Calvin honestly admitted. "We need to observe him. I flushed his system and administered antidote injections. I just don't know what kind of poison it was. Tests need to be done, of course, and an ultrasound might be helpful, but our local vets don't have the equipment for that. In any case, let's hope the injections work. Tomorrow morning, I'll do something else for him." "Tomorrow?" Melanie asked, blushing slightly. "Oh, right. It's too late to go back now. I'll set up the guest room for you. I can sleep in the car, really. But that's not the point. I just need to administer more injections in the morning. I don't want you getting close to him. He might react and hurt you." "Thank you, Calvin." Melanie looked at him with grateful eyes. Later, they had dinner. Due to her worry, Melanie didn't prepare anything elaborate, as she admitted herself. She only made a salad and cooked some pasta, but it tasted so good that Calvin once again realized what a great host Melanie was. And then, while lying on the couch, Calvin thought about what to do with the farmer. But what could he do? Punch him in the face? But for what reason? Report to the police? Calvin couldn't come up with a solution to help Melanie, so he drifted off to sleep. He woke up at 6 o'clock and immediately went to check on his four-legged patient. The dog greeted him at the threshold, standing confidently on its legs. When it saw Calvin, it even wagged its tail. Feeling better, Calvin smiled. "That means we did the right thing." He patted the dog's head. In response, the animal cautiously licked his hand, then looked at him with loyalty in its eyes. Yes, it remembered that this person saved it. He was good. He was one of them. "Melanie, he's doing fine. I won't need to administer any more injections," he happily informed the hostess, who was already busy in the kitchen. "Just add the medication I left to his water. I've written on the bottle how many drops to use. Give it for about 3 days and call me if anything comes up. I'm heading out." "What?" Melanie was taken aback. "And breakfast?" "Melanie, I need to get home, change, and head to work. You know, us office workers always need to be presentable," Calvin said with a hint of irony. Melanie saw him off, lost in thought. "Calvin is still hiding something from me," she pondered. Calvin managed to get home and make it to work on time. The day passed with the usual patient matters. In the evening, he had a night shift, and only as the night drew closer did he send Melanie a message, asking how she was doing. Melanie seemed to be expecting that message from him. She replied immediately, saying that the dog was perfectly healthy now and was enjoying life. Perhaps tomorrow, she'd put him back on the leash. "How about you? When is your hospital appointment?" Calvin massaged. "Tomorrow morning. Everything's good on my end." "Good night," Melanie replied. Calvin just smiled. Good night. It would be nice, but it was uncertain how the night would go. And it was crucial that Melanie would be at the clinic tomorrow. He didn't have any appointments. He wouldn't have a chance to meet her. He would tell her everything, just a bit later. Yes, he would tell her everything a bit later. She would understand him. She would believe him. At least, that's what Calvin hoped for. Afterward, he decided to gather information about Tristan. Melanie briefly mentioned him, but he wanted to know more. Calvin found his social media profile. He looked at the photo, memorized it. He needed to figure out how to reason with the furious farmer. The night passed peacefully. In the morning, Calvin hurried home to avoid running into Melanie. Just a couple of days later, an unexpected encounter occurred. Calvin was on duty in the clinic when a burly, older man burst into his office. "Doctor, please, I think I'm dying," he implored, and immediately began unbuttoning his shirt. "Whoa there, no need to panic. First, explain what's happening to you," a middle-aged nurse, instead of the doctor, sternly told the patient. "I've got a massive lump, and it hurts," the patient complained. "Calvin, can you take a look?" the nurse asked, looking at him in surprise as he stood there staring at the patient. Calvin couldn't believe his eyes. It was Tristan, the same guy who had been causing trouble for Melanie. "Yes, of course, I'll take a look." Calvin nodded. "Show me." Tristan had a huge lump on his back, about the size of a chicken egg. At first glance, Calvin understood. It was a simple sebaceous cyst that could be opened and removed right there in the dressing room. "Complicated case," he said slowly, ignoring the surprised look of the nurse. "Nurse, prepare the tools. Let's proceed with the removal." "Right here," the patient exclaimed. "What if it's cancer? What if I die after your manipulations?" "You won't die, at least not in the near future, as long as you live in harmony with your conscience. I've seen such formations. They appear in people who do a lot of harm. Admit it. Have you been mean to someone? You have, I can tell by your eyes. Now it's materializing as these abscesses." Now both the nurse and the patient were looking at him in astonishment. Calvin was getting really worked up. The nurse was already laying out the tools, not quite understanding what was happening. Maybe Calvin was a bit overworked. She decided not to intervene for now and just do her job. Calvin quickly opened the tumor, did everything necessary, and when the nurse applied the dressing, he whispered in the patient's ear, "Believe it or not, I have a gift. I sometimes see what will happen to a person, so if you keep mistreating a young woman, you'll keep getting these lumps. I don't know who she is, but I see that she's pregnant. She'll give birth soon." "Understood, doctor. I won't do it." That's how Calvin solved Tristan's problem. He really stopped bothering Melanie, and after reading on the internet, he even found confirmation of the doctor's words. It's true. It happens, you do harm, and it manifests on you later. He had already promised Melanie not to touch her. Calvin's parents began to suspect that their son was in a relationship with a girl. He often went somewhere, was thoughtful. One day, his father asked directly when his son would introduce him to his chosen one's mother. Calvin just smiled in response. Oh, if only his parents knew how complicated everything was. It had been almost a month since he started talking to Melanie. They were just friends, and he hadn't revealed who he truly was yet. And the further it went, the harder it turned out to be. On that November morning, Calvin was resting after a night shift. Snow was falling outside, mixed with rain. It was slushy and cold outside, but warm at home. Wrapped in a cozy blanket, he heard his mobile phone ringing. It was Melanie. "Calvin, I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know what to do." He heard her voice on the other end. Melanie was speaking quickly, with a hint of strain. Calvin understood that labor had started. Tristan had a massive lump on his back, about the size of a chicken egg. Calvin understood right away. It was a simple sebaceous cyst that could be opened and removed in the clinic. "A tricky case," he said slowly, ignoring the surprised nurse's look. "Nurse, prepare the tools. Let's remove it." "Right here," the patient exclaimed. "What if it's cancer? What if I die after your procedures?" "You won't die, at least not anytime soon, as long as you live with a clear conscience. I've seen similar cases. They appear in people who do a lot of harm. Admit it. Have you been unkind to someone? You have. I can see it in your eyes. Now it's manifesting as these swellings." Both the nurse and the patient were now looking at him in astonishment. Calvin was getting increasingly passionate. The nurse was already laying out the instruments, not fully understanding what was happening. Maybe Calvin was a bit overworked. She decided not to intervene for now and just get on with her job. Calvin quickly opened the lump, did what was needed, and when the nurse applied the dressing, he whispered to the patient, "Believe it or not, I have a gift. I sometimes see a person's fate. So, if you keep mistreating a young woman, you'll keep getting these lumps. I don't know who she is, but I see that she's pregnant. She'll give birth soon." "Understood, doctor. I won't do it." That's how Calvin solved Tristan's issue. He truly stopped bothering Melanie. After reading about it online, he even found some confirmation of the doctor's words. It's true. Such things happen. You do harm, and it comes back to you later. He had already promised Melanie not to touch her. Calvin's parents began to suspect that their son was in a relationship with a girl. He often went somewhere, seemed thoughtful. One day, his father directly asked when he would introduce him to the mother of his chosen one. Calvin just smiled in response. Oh, if only his parents knew how complicated everything was. It had been nearly a month since he started talking to Melanie. They were just friends, and he hadn't revealed his true identity yet. And the more time passed, the harder it became. On that November morning, Calvin was resting after a night shift. Snow and rain were falling outside. It was chilly outside but cozy at home. Wrapped in a warm blanket, he heard his phone ringing. It was Melanie. "Calvin, sorry to bother you, but I don't know what to do," he heard her voice on the line. Melanie was speaking rapidly, with a hint of distress. Calvin understood that labor had begun. "Calvin, the ambulance says they won't be able to reach us. The road is nothing but mud. They tried to drive, but they said we'll have to walk to the main road, and I'm having contractions." "Melanie, don't panic," Calvin replied as he quickly got dressed. "How frequent are the contractions?" "I haven't been timing them," Melanie answered, slightly surprised. "Maybe every 10 to 15 minutes, with breaks." "This is just the beginning. There's still time. I'll figure out what to do, and you start getting ready little by little. Maybe these are just the early signs. You still have 2 weeks to go, remember." "Calvin, I don't know," Melanie whimpered. "I'm sorry for bothering you again." "Stop apologizing. Calm down and wait. Everything will be fine." And Calvin rushed out of the house. His parents had heard the entire conversation and exchanged glances. Who is giving birth at their son's place? He works in a completely different field. What is their son hiding from them? Meanwhile, Calvin was already racing to Melanie in his car. At the same time, an ambulance was waiting on the road. The medics even considered walking, but in knee-deep mud, how could they transport a woman in labor? They could only wait. Soon, Calvin joined them. "Bo Calvin, what brings you here?" the ambulance doctor exclaimed in surprise. "Same reason as you. Welcoming a birthing mother," Calvin replied. "That's good. Who is she to you?" "A good friend." "Calvin, why are you here?" Melanie repeated. "You should be at work. What if there's an accident or a fire, God forbid?" "What does an accident or fire have to do with this?" "Calvin, when did you join the emergency services? I thought you were still working as a surgeon." "Surgeon?" Melanie gasped in pain and stared at Calvin. "Calvin is actually a young and promising surgeon," the ambulance doctor chimed in again. "A surgeon?" Melanie's voice rose with pain. "But why? Why did you tell me you were working in the hospital administration?" "Later, everything can wait," Calvin gently reassured her, taking her hand. "Don't worry, I'll explain everything. Right now, you shouldn't think about anything else but the baby." They quickly got Melanie to the hospital. Without further adventures, Calvin remained at the hospital. He couldn't be at home while Melanie was giving birth. His thoughts were solely on her. He sat in his room, filling out paperwork, while imagining her going through the pain. Every cell in his body seemed to feel her agony. Calvin had never imagined this before. No, paperwork wasn't on his mind. He dropped his pen, stood up, and headed to the maternity ward. "Just gave birth, your acquaintance," the midwife at the entrance informed him cheerfully. "It's a boy, 3,755 grams. Upon hearing this, Calvin sat down on a couch. A warm wave enveloped him. A boy, a healthy lad. Melanie was now a mother, but immediately, doubts began to knight his consciousness. And who was he? Just a good acquaintance. This child was that guy's, the one who died on his operating table, and he would always remember that. He would look at the boy and remember how he couldn't save Samuel. Although why did he assume he would be looking? After all, Melanie would have to tell everything now, and she probably wouldn't want to keep in touch. Or maybe not tell everything. Yes, a surgeon. Yes, he prepared Samuel for surgery, but he hadn't done anything. That was pure truth. And how is the mother feeling? Calvin lifted his head and looked at the midwife, who was standing nearby. She's okay. She's been taken to her room already. Probably sleeping. Po thing went through a lot. The midwife shook her head. Calvin returned to his thoughts. What happens next? The next day, using his professional position, Calvin entered Melanie's room. Two other women were in the room as well, and one of them greeted Calvin first. It turned out that earlier this year, he had treated her in grown toenail. "Doctor, you have golden hands. My finger barely hurt back then, and it healed quickly," she took the opportunity to say. Then, nodding to her roommate, both women slowly left the room. The young mothers understood that the doctor needed to talk to Melanie. They exchanged meaningful glances. "I won't stay long," Calvin kindly informed them. Melanie lay on the bed, her curly hair spread across the pillow, her nightshirt now 2 sizes bigger, revealing a slender shoulder. Melanie noticed this and shyly covered herself with a sheet. "So, you really are a surgeon," she mused, looking at Calvin. "Why did you lie to me?" "I couldn't tell you the whole truth," Calvin admitted. "When I found out that your husband died in my operating room, I was at a loss. No, I'm not responsible for his death, but I felt so sorry for you, and I wanted to help you somehow." "Just sorry." "At first, yes. And then, Melanie, I realized I can't be without you. Yes, I'm just your friend, and I'll stay that way if you want. But know that I need you, and I'll accept your son. If you weren't at fault for Samuel's death, why did you keep silent?" Her eyes seemed to peer into his soul. "At first, I thought it was unnecessary to tell you, and then I thought you might still blame me. You love your husband so much." "Loved," she agreed and closed her eyes. Calvin remained silent. Melanie did too. "Calvin, I'm sorry, I'm tired," she finally said. "Rest," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, he kissed her, not on the lips, just her hand, and she didn't pull it away. The next evening, Calvin came again, and they talked for a long time in the doctor's lounge, where they were allowed to enter. Yes, Melanie was upset with Calvin for his lie, but in the short time they had known each other, she had grown accustomed to him and fallen in love. Through all his actions and deeds, Calvin proved he was a wonderful person, and perhaps he would be a wonderful father to her son, Ian. That's what she decided to name her son. Calvin brought her and the baby home from the maternity ward. To say that Calvin's parents were surprised would be an understatement. He hadn't been dating anyone in the village, and suddenly he brought a wife home, and with a baby, no less. At first, his mother treated Melanie with skepticism, but with time, Sophia's heart warmed. She realized that Melanie loved Calvin and was a good housekeeper. 3 years passed. Ian was already attending daycare. Calvin continued working as a surgeon at the hospital, and Melanie, having enrolled in a college of culture through distance learning, was pursuing her studies. Their family was an exemplary one to look up to. Calvin and Melanie were a handsome couple, young, attractive, in love. Many envied their relationship, and nothing seemed to foreshadow any storms. One day, Earl visited the village. He was still working at the ministry and had even become a minor manager. After that incident, Earl hadn't visited his parents even once, but now he decided to visit on his own. From his father, he learned that Calvin had gotten married. Of course, Edward recognized in Calvin's wife the same girl he had met a few years back when Calvin, with a sad expression, told him about the twists of fate and expressed his sympathy for the death of her first husband. And now, she was Calvin's wife. At first, he grew concerned, thinking Calvin might be up to something. But then he realized that Calvin wasn't thinking about anything like that, and he relaxed. Calvin was working well, and he tried to avoid crossing paths with the chief physician. He didn't bring up this incident either. It should be noted that there were many ambiguous situations in his career, including payment issues for employees. But everything seemed to work out for him because he had good connections in the Ministry of Health. And now his son was working there too. So, one evening, after his son's arrival, they sat for a while over a delicious dinner, and afterward, Edward and Earl stepped out onto the terrace of their beautiful mansion to breathe in some fresh air. During their conversation, the topic of Calvin came up. Do you know who his wife is? Edward widened his eyes and shook his head. You won't believe it. It's the wife of that guy who died during surgery. Yeah, that same one. Are you serious? Earl exclaimed. And how did that happen? Love. At first, I was waiting for some catch too, but now I understand. It's definitely love. Calvin's such a fool, raising someone else's child, and he's happy about it. Definitely a fool, Earl agreed. They shifted the conversation to other topics, and it seemed that the topic of Calvin and his wife was inconsequential. But not for Earl. He thought about his father's words long into the night. So, Calvin is happy. In the morning, Earl decided to see who this beautiful wife of Calvin's was. He found Calvin on the internet. They were no longer friends, so they didn't take an interest in each other's lives. But this was different. Earl found joint photos of Calvin and Melanie, and he saw their son. So, he's happy, you say? Earl hissed softly, and a plan matured in his mind. He was heading to the club, intending to talk to Melanie and tell her something about her husband. Earl was sure that the young woman was unaware that it was Calvin who operated on her husband. Melanie was surprised when the guard informed her that an unknown man was waiting for her at the entrance. She descended and saw a presentable, respectable man whom she definitely didn't know. Hello, he stepped forward. I'm Earl, Calvin's classmate. We used to work together. We need to talk. I'm listening. Melanie agreed, a bit tense. Maybe in the park, Earl suggested. Melanie nodded again. And there, on a bench, Earl admitted that he had been silent for a long time. But now he couldn't remain silent. He simply didn't have the right. He needed to open Melanie's eyes to her husband. Your husband is a criminal, Earl said. Melanie shuddered and recoiled from the conversation partner. You are saying awful things. I'm sorry, but I don't want to listen to you. She turned to leave, but Earl grabbed her hand. Do you know that it was Calvin who operated on your first husband? I know, Melanie said calmly, and I also know that Samuel died even before the operation. Is that so? Earl smirked. His hands were shaking that day. He was hungover. I saw it all myself because I was the anesthesiologist for that surgery. I even told him to be more careful. If he couldn't do it, it would be better not to start. We could have called for an air ambulance. But he decided he could do anything, even in any condition. I don't believe you, Melanie whispered, paling. Calvin doesn't drink, and he never has. Indeed, after what happened, he stopped drinking alcohol. My father even felt sorry for him. We studied together. Although Calvin barely made it, he still got his diploma. We came here together. My father didn't make a fuss. The pathologist gave the necessary conclusion, and that was it. But I couldn't work with him anymore. I moved to the city, got a job there. I apologize for telling you all this, but you need to know what kind of person you're living with. Melanie listened to Earl and couldn't move from her spot. Could it be true that Calvin was involved in Samuel's death, or was this man lying? And why would he lie? Melanie remembered her first meeting with Calvin, their initial conversations. He didn't tell her he was a surgeon. Yes, he explained why later, but if he lied once, why not lie again? Melanie began to believe Earl's words more and more. Then, without saying a word in response, she abruptly turned and ran in the direction of her home. Earl, who had been sitting in the park, smiled contentedly. Now, the former friend will have big problems. Calvin will try to prove otherwise, but he won't succeed. Melanie hastily packed her things, barely explaining anything to Calvin's parents, and rushed to the daycare. Then, along with her little son, they left for the village. Melanie understood that this wasn't a solution, and she wouldn't be able to live in the old house with a small child and no means of support. But it was okay. She needed to calm down and figure everything out. However, she didn't want to stay under the same roof as Calvin for even a single minute. Yes, the house was abandoned, but on the same day, Melanie began to clean and tidy everything up. In the process, she watched Ian play sadly with a toy car in the overgrown backyard. But this was still better than interacting with Calvin. Calvin's mother, Sophia, called him at work and told him that his daughter-in-law had run away with their grandchild. She didn't mention where. Calvin tried calling Melanie, but her phone was unreachable. After finishing his rounds with patients, He hurried home to discuss everything. On the way, Calvin spotted Earl. He was happily content with life, driving in a car with his father. Suspicion crept into Calvin's mind. He decided to dial a number he hadn't called for several years. Surprisingly, his former friend answered. "Earl, did you say anything to Melanie?" Calvin asked without unnecessary words. "Calvin, is that you, buddy?" Earl exclaimed joyfully. "How glad I am to hear you. Good for you for calling." "Earl, I asked you," Calvin persisted. "But I saw your wife, sweetheart. Oh, by the way, she was very surprised to find out that you were responsible for her first husband's death." "I'm sorry, I thought she knew," Earl cheerfully informed him. "What did you say?" Calvin's stomach churned at what he heard. "What have you come up with?" "It's all true. You have to prove otherwise." Earl laughed and ended the conversation. At home, Calvin couldn't come to his senses for a long time. He had been made the scapegoat, and he certainly wasn't guilty of it. And Melanie apparently believed it. How could he prove otherwise? Jasper, seeing his son's suffering, suggested having an open conversation. Calvin told him everything about the details of that operation. Jasper listened, then fell silent. "We need to get this family to open up," he finally said. "Son, I have a plan." Jasper shared that his colleague's son was involved in video production, including hidden camera recordings. They could convince him to install a camera and then invite Earl for a frank conversation. And once Melanie learns the truth, she will realize that she believed in all those rumors for no reason. But where to install the camera? Where to invite Earl? The suggestion came from Michael, the same guy who was into filming. In the VIP lounge of the most famous cafe in the village. There's no crowd, and they could relax and let something slip. That's what they did. Later, Calvin called Earl and suggested meeting up for a drink to make amends. "Earl, I was wrong. We were friends for so many years, and then everything went wrong. Let's make up, okay?" Calvin said when he called Earl again. "I invite you to our best cafe, my treat." Calvin knew Earl well. He was a sucker for a freebie, and it worked just as he expected. The former friend came to the cafe in good spirits. "And will the ladies be here?" he joked as he settled into a comfortable chair. "Whatever you wish." Calvin nodded. They had a shot each, then another, reminiscing about childhood, youth, and their studies. At some point, it became clear that Earl had had quite a few drinks. Calvin decided to take action. "Earl, tell me, why do you hate me?" he asked softly. Earl paused for a second, then broke into an ugly grin. "It turns out you don't believe in genuine friendship after all." "Oh, Calvin, I had a different opinion of you," Earl sneered. "And I had a different opinion of you. I knew you were cowardly, but not malicious." Struggling to maintain his composure, trying to appear calm, Calvin said, "Why did you lie to Melanie? And what did I say? That you were guilty. Now you can't prove otherwise, and your idiotic wife believed it. She dumped you, right, ran away, and where's your happiness now? All burst like a soap bubble. I hate you. You deserved it." "Earl, you know that I'm not involved in Samuel's death. You were responsible for the patient's death. But I kept silent all these years." "Yes, I sent him to the other side. I administered a double dose of anesthesia. So what? I got carried away at a party, didn't think much of it, and so what? Daddy covered for me anyway. And you, well, how noble you are, you kept silent. So now you're paying for your silence. Your wife left you, and not only that, I'll also tell the press that a doctor like you works here. But the chief physician will suffer too. We have powerful protectors, and you, fool, won't wash your hands of this for the rest of your life. That's it, I'm done with you," Earl said, swaying, and headed for the exit. Calvin remained seated. He was shaken. All these years he hadn't suspected how much Earl hated him, and for what? After all, it seemed like Earl had it all. Opportunities and wealth. The only thing he lacked was intelligence. Perhaps that's why he hated Calvin. The video turned out great. Calvin spent a long time pondering what to do with it and eventually decided to consult Henry. His colleague was certainly surprised that Calvin had kept silent about this for so long, but then admitted that it's difficult to speak out when you lack protection. I never liked the chief physician from the start, Henry added. Then he suggested taking the recording to the investigative committee. Let them sort it out. They might dismiss it as the ramblings of a drunk person. Let it be that way. But if they take the case seriously, Edward will be thrown out of his seat at the speed of sound. They might want to put me on trial too, Calvin guessed. I don't think so. You didn't do anything. Just explain how things happened, that's all, Henry reassured him. The main thing is to find your wife and show her this recording. Do you have any idea where she might be? Of course, Calvin had the urge to rush to the village as soon as Melanie disappeared, but would she have listened to him then? Now he had a chance. Melanie was clearing weeds in the yard when she heard a car pull up to the house. Yes, she had anticipated that Calvin might come here, but she hoped it wouldn't happen. It hurt her to see the person who had done that to Samuel. She was living with a monster, and it was terrifying. Don't come near me, she shouted, holding a pitchfork out in front of her, which happened to be conveniently nearby. Hit me if you want, Calvin said softly. Just listen first. I'm not guilty of anything. You believed a man who is responsible for Samuel's death. I have a recording where he confesses everything. You're lying again. I've been telling you the truth all this time. I only kept one thing from you, the true cause of Samuel's death, because I was afraid to lose you. But I'm not guilty. Calvin stepped forward resolutely, pushed the pitchfork out of Melanie's hands in one motion, and then handed her a phone. See for yourself. At first, Melanie wanted to throw the phone in her husband's face, but then something stopped her, and she began to watch the recording from the cafe. What does this mean? She whispered, watching it all the way through. Earl came to the surgery drunk that day. His father, the chief physician, refused to call for a medical evacuation, and Earl miscalculated the anesthesia dosage. Because of that, your husband's heart stopped. Yes, I knew all of this. But, I repeat, I stayed silent. At first, because I understood that I couldn't achieve anything alone. Then I met you and I was afraid of hurting you even more with this truth. I was there, but I couldn't do anything. That's all, Calvin said, and then he stepped back and sat on the porch, lowering his head. Melanie stood there bewildered. She had run away without talking to her husband. It was foolish. Yes, Samuel couldn't be brought back, but Calvin. He had become a loving husband and the father of her child. Calvin, I should have told you everything myself, she finally said. I would have understood. And would you have suffered, realizing that Earl and his father were living comfortably and holding high positions? He bitterly said. Why did you need this truth? To prevent what happened, Melanie said quietly. She walked up to Calvin, sat next to him, and rested her head on his shoulder. Calvin, forgive me. Let's go home. That's why I came here. He smiled and hugged his wife's shoulders. Where's Ian? He's sleeping in the house. And then they heard the pitter-patter of little bare feet on the floor. Daddy, Ian exclaimed joyfully and rushed into his father's arms. And suddenly, everything fell into place. They were all together again because they were a family, and the investigative committee became interested in the recording. Both Earl and his father were summoned to give explanations. Calvin wasn't forgotten either. The pathologist was called in, and although later they concluded that it was just the ramblings of an intoxicated person, the Ministry of Health distanced themselves from their former friends, and soon Earl was dismissed under some other pretext. The chief physician was removed for exceeding authority. A criminal case was initiated for misappropriation of budget funds, and he was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison with asset confiscation. The pathologist retired and went down south to be with his children. In short, in the village, only Calvin remained. He was left untouched, and he continued to work as before. Henry is now the chief physician, and everything in the hospital seems to be getting back on track, just like in Calvin's family. Melanie returned, and after the investigations, they were provided with a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. Now it would definitely come in handy, as soon Ian's little sister is due to arrive.